or introduce our first presenter, who is Donald Murray, we're very happy to have him joining us today. And most of the time, he is a lawyer in Halifax, Nova Scotia, but he has a research interest in the hockey of the 1920s and 1930s, and his discussion of the management of concussions in the 1931 Stanley Cup playoffs is an outgrowth from that research. And he's got a pre-recorded talk, which I believe Madison will be going ahead and sharing. So I'll kick things off with Donald Murray's talk.
Good afternoon. One of the unique features of the Stanley Cup is the ability to touch the names that have been etched into its surface, to sometimes contemplate a name that's either been forgotten or was never known before. If the name is old and the championship was long ago, we may only be able to come across the name on one of those metal bands kept under glass at the Hockey Hall of Fame or in a photograph. When I saw this version of the cup and started to see the actual names, I saw the name of Sir Henry Grey alongside those of Howie Morenz, Aurel Joliet, the Mantha brothers, and Albert, the battleship Leduc. So who was Sir Henry Grey? I dug out the team pictures, and indeed there he was. And what does he have to do with embracing change, safety and medicine in hockey 2021? Sir Henry Grey was a Scottish surgeon by training, and then the First World War took him off to Belgium for 4 years to learn trench warfare. He wrote a well-regarded book called The Early Treatment of War Wounds, and then he immigrated to Canada and fell in love with hockey. He loved the high-skill hockey of small men like Howie Morenz and Aurel Joliet, and he hated violent hockey, played by what he called get-your-man kind of players, the ones who indulged in intentional, purposeful, and frankly dangerous violence. The reason I want to talk about him today is because in the spring of 1931, Dr. Henry Grey had to employ all of the skills that he'd learned in the First World War trenches of Belgium to keep the Montreal Canadiens on the ice. Dr. Grey's interventions, particularly with players who suffered from concussions and repeat concussions, allowed players to return to play with a minimum amount of games missed, to play effectively, and in fact to be the difference in the outcome of crucial games. Back in 1931, teams dressed 15 players, including the goaltender. So there were 14 skaters, and 11 of the Canadiens' 14 skaters that year suffered some kind of injury justifying medical attention or intervention. The team played 10 games and another 2 because of overtime. And of those 140 man games, they only missed 6. That was a remarkable accomplishment, attributable very much to the work of Sir Henry Grey. So I'm going to confine myself today to the management of the concussions. I calculated the number of these simply by reports that a player was knocked unconscious. The real number of concussions by today's standards would calculate to a much higher number. 4 different players were either knocked out over the course of the 10 games, either by a collision with the ice or by being struck in the head by a stick from an opposing player. One of the players suffered 1 concussion. Another of the players suffered 2 different knockout incidents on 2 different games. 2 other players suffered at least 1 knockout experience and perhaps another on a subsequent game. There's no doubt that each of those injuries were serious. To begin with Albert Leduc. Mr. Leduc suffered 2 confirmable concussions. His first occurred in game 1 when he pitched forward headfirst onto the ice and hit the front of his head, cutting himself over his left eye. Reporters described him as still groggy an hour later. Initially, Dr. Grey's team dressed Leduc's head wound and then fitted him out with a rugby leather-type helmet for game 2. When Leduc took the ice on game 2, he soon discarded the helmet, which meant that his spectacular header later in that same game was unprotected. but there was no report of any concussion or loss of consciousness in that Game 2 incident. In the middle of Game 4, Leduc received a check that resulted in him again crashing the ice. The incident left him badly dazed, and the reporters who were there said he was so badly stunned that half an hour after the game, his eyes were glassy and could hardly recognize anyone. So after that second concussion incident, Dr. Gray took over. He knew about impact injuries to the brain, as well as contre-coup injuries, which happen when the brain bounces and rotates inside the skull as a result of an impact. Dr. Gray had discussed those kinds of contre-coup injuries in his book. This was scientific knowledge about brain injury that he understood and had applied for at least a decade. But how to fix Albert Leduc and how to fix him quickly. Dr. Gray's first step in treatment was what he called absolute rest. If need be, sedatives would be employed to ensure the quiet, such as morphia, omnipalm, and opium extract. So these are narcotics. The objective was to get the patient to sleep as much as possible. Dr. Gray spoke in his book about continuing to monitor the subtle and evanescent symptoms which could provide evidence of variation in the patient's intracranial pressure. So there was ongoing monitoring. He believed in the power of the brain to accommodate injury, where one part carries on in what Dr. Gray called a marvelous way, despite significant injury to other parts of the brain. At the same time, he worried about latent brain injuries being exposed later on in a player's life. For the first 9 days after Leduc's injury in Game 4, he was kept at Dr. Gray's hospital under that enforced absolute rest. During that time, he lost 18 pounds. On day 10, he got back on the ice in an empty arena for some skating. That appearance was described as extremely shaky. On day 11 of his recovery, he skated on the fringe of a team practice that was open to the public. And although his skating looked a bit uncertain at first, as time went by, he became more graceful and gathered back some of his speed. The next night, he actually played a few shifts on defense in Game 8, though his work was not particularly effective. Dr. Gray had Leduc return to the hospital after the game, spend an overnight, and then released him in the morning for another private session of skating at the Forum. Leduc then rejoined the Canadiens lineup and took a regular turn in Games 9 and Game 10. Dr. Gray had managed his patient's successful return to play in the shortest possible time, which was the same medical objective he had served when dealing with soldiers on the Western Front in World War I. Was Dr. Gray's management of Albert Leduc typical? Compare it with the other Game 1 concussion casualty, Georges Mantha. Georges Mantha received a cross-check to the chin, which both knocked him out, but also gave him a cut that required stitches to close. The incident was regarded primarily as a cutting incident initially, except that 42 hours later, before the start of Game 2, Georges was complaining of feeling ill. He played the whole of that second game with a severe headache. Georges scored the game's only goal in the first period and went on to play the next 8 games without further injury and without any need for hospitalization. He ended the campaign as the Canadiens' leading scorer in the playoffs. Like Albert Leduc, Georges Mantha was allowed the opportunity to play through his first concussion. That medical restraint had been rewarded with team success, while Leduc's experience showed the risk of that strategy. What about George's older brother, Silvio, the captain of the Canadiens? Silvio Mantha suffered a series of notable head injuries throughout the team's 10 playoff games. Some of them left him so dizzy that he required the help of his teammates to stand up. Then in Game 7, Tommy Cook of the Blackhawks brought his stick down on Mantha's head, stretching him on the ice for a 9 count, or until he was revived, according to the reporters. The head strike in Game 7 marked an obvious change in Mantha's play. In both Games 8 and 9, the captain appeared feeble. His responses to the game were so much slower than those of his defense partner that the Chicago Blackhawks started to shade their offense over to Mantha's side. As soon as Game 9 was over, the Canadiens and Dr. Gray changed their tack with respect to the management of Silvio Mantha. The doctor had 70 hours. He made the captain disappear. So any of the other Canadiens that still needed medical treatment were discharged from Dr. Gray's private hospital. Silvio Mantha was admitted. While enforcing the absolute rest treatment that had eventually worked for Albert Leduc, Dr. Gray also added the element of isolation for Captain Silvio Mantha. And just hours before the start of the sudden death final game, the captain reappeared at the Forum ready to play. And he did take a regular turn in that game. So with these three players, we see similarities in the initial response to an on-ice knockout. First, bandage any wounds, give the player the opportunity to continue to play. And if the player succeeds, he will continue to play. If the player starts to show a deterioration in performance or was injured again, then the player would be hospitalized and put on enforced rest, induced by narcotics if necessary. Eventually, the player would be provided with an opportunity to return to the ice and then to return to play. That process was easier with Leduc and Georges Mantha, who were substitutes, not starters, and whose timetable was not as urgent as it had been for the captain, Silvio Mantha. But the essential features of today's treatment protocols were already being followed 90 years ago, because the experience of the First World War had already created the medical knowledge of how to address these kinds of brain injuries. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to get such a detailed look at how these injuries were treated 90 years ago. We'll move on for now. So save any questions that we have for Donald. We'll move on for now to our next presentation, which will be by Naya St. Amant. And she is a first-year PhD student at Queen's University in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies. She has an MA and a BAA in criminology, and her research focus is on risk, injury, and social controls in sport. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Awesome. So everyone can see that, okay, I'm assuming?
Looks great.
Great. Awesome, thanks. So today I'm going to be sharing a piece of my master's research, which my master's supervisor and I, Dr. Dina Simonetto, are currently working on a paper. So this presentation is sort of a rough draft presentation of the paper. So I do want to acknowledge that my master's was funded by SSHRC, so an acknowledgement and thanks to them for this. And I'll just jump into it here. So I'm going to be talking to you guys today about coaching perceptions of the impact of Rowan's Law on the culture of sport in minor league hockey. And Rowan's Law is a youth concussion legislation in Ontario. And I'll kind of unpack that title as we go along here. But this project stems from the increasing concern over concussions in sport in recent years and the construction of this concern in sport as a social problem. Particularly, my focus is on youth sports here, which has a heightened concern in recent years due to the deaths and permanent injuries of young athletes, unfortunately. And Rowan's Law stems from the death in 2013 of 17-year-old Rowan Stringer in Ottawa. And so due to the rising concern of concussions, there's been an implementation of social controls to prevent concussions in sports. So we can see this across all levels of play. So for instance, in the NHL, we can see concussion spotters and rules and regulation changes regarding head contact. But at the youth level, what we're seeing is these administrative acts or policies being implemented to prevent concussions in youth sport. So my project largely takes from the work of Dominic Malcolm, who focuses on the medicalization of the concussion crisis. So what I mean here is that at the conceptual level, concussion crisis is defined using medical terminology. And then at the institutional level, these social controls being implemented are very medically oriented. And I'll kind of explore how Rowan's Law is medically oriented in a couple of slides here. But what's missing is at the interactional level with these social actors in sport, and the fact that the law is kind of devoid of any cultural consideration here. And specifically, my research focuses on the culture of risk in sport. So, I mean, throughout this weekend, we've heard about a lot of scholars presenting on hegemonic masculinity and hockey masculinities, and these masculinities sort of promote this ideology of the culture of risk where athletes will sacrifice their bodies and brains for sport. So they'll play through pain, they'll hide injury, they'll place their bodies as well as other teammates' bodies on the line. And specifically, my focus was on coaches due to the very key role that they play in the socialization process of athletes into this culture of risk, especially at the youth level. And then obviously, my focus is hockey in Canada here, due to the kind of symbolic nature that hockey holds in Canada and the nationhood present in athletes that kind of elevates the culture of risk for hockey athletes in Canada. So this led to a couple general research questions here. My first kind of focus was on, how are these medically oriented policies such as Rowan's Law impacting coaching decisions on the ground level in minor league hockey? And second, are these medically oriented policies such as Rowan's Law facilitating any cultural changes in minor league hockey and, specifically towards the culture of risk? So to do this, I interviewed 12 coaches in minor league hockey in Ontario at the AAA, U15 and U17 levels of play, which are both contact boys levels. So I want to start with my analysis here with what is Rowan's Law supposed to do? So what did the government of Ontario want to happen with this law? And so the couple of main key things here that they wanted was that they wanted to prevent, identify, and manage concussions. And they do this through these 4 guidelines in Rowan's Law. So increasing education through an implementation of resources such as the concussion awareness resource and concussion protocols to athletes, coaches, and parents. And the etc. just refers to any other prescribed individuals such as trainers, referees. And so what's happening on this level is that, to prevent, to teach these social actors in sport how to prevent concussions are, information such as, what equipment to use, respecting the rules of the game. And then on the identifying concussions, it's very focused on, recognizing this different signs and symptoms that can kind of showcase in athletes. And then at the management level, it's very focused on that removal. What do I do if my athlete does have a concussion? How do I return them to play? How do they heal? So very medically oriented knowledge enhancement being put forth here. And then the second one, a little bit more clearly medicalized here, is the reliance on medical professionals. So all sporting organizations must have a removal from play and return to play protocol put in place, where even if it's not necessarily a medical professional making the decision, they are still engaging in, medically oriented actions by removing and returning these athletes to play. While Rowan's Law and these more medically oriented guidelines are very important and necessary in preventing concussions, there are some things to consider here that are maybe preventing these things from happening. So the first is that Rowan's Law is very ambiguous. So the language in the law is very vague. And so I'm just going to go through a couple examples here. So the first one is this designated person language in the legislation. So it designates a person who is responsible for ensuring that, and then there's a variety of different responsibilities here. I just threw a couple up here. But for example, an athlete being removed from play or alerting parents to the removal if they're under the age of 18. So while it's good at outlining what the responsibilities are, there's a lot of things missing from the instruction to this designated person. So just a couple of questions off the top of my head here that are missing is, who is this designated person? Can it be anybody? Can it be a parent on the sideline? Does it have to be somebody on the coaching staff? How much authority does this person have? If the athlete wants to return and the parents of the athlete want that person to return, does the trainer have the authority to trump that? So what's missing here is more clear direction as to who the designated person is. Does everyone have to be aware of who this person is? What is their authority? So it's leading to a lot of complexity and unclarity at the coaching level. So for instance, when I talked to coaches, they reported that they would leave the majority of concussion removal up to trainers, but then would tell me a story, a couple minutes later where they were inherently involved in the decision making. And then further, some coaches would mention that for more minor signs of concussion, so for example, a headache, they would not leave that up to trainers and they would themselves make the call on that. So as you can see, there's a lot of vague language regarding the designated person and a lack of clarity, which prevents these protocols from really taking place effectively. And then the second thing that I want to mention here about kind of the law and the language in it is regarding the implementation of the concussion awareness resource and protocols. So the law says that the sporting actors in sport have to confirm that they have reviewed the concussion code of conduct and concussion awareness resource. But the issue here is that it leads it up to the sporting organization how they disseminate this information. And according to coaches, the majority of them received, and the parents and athletes received a PDF document and a PDF document alone. And what was happening, according to coaches who even admitted that they themselves were just signing at the dotted line and not actually reading through the resource. And they purported that they imagined that both athletes and parents were doing similar things. And thus, the information in these resources are not actually being disseminated accurately to the social actors in sport. So other than ambiguity, the other thing that's kind of missing here is culture, as I've already mentioned. So while we might think that the culture of risk and things like this have shifted because of the heightened concern in concussions, this is not completely true according to the coaches I spoke to. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but we can kind of pull out the bold here of what coaches were saying. So, athletes try to hide things. They don't want to show any signs of so-called weakness. It's a badge of honor to be hurt in play, and they understand manipulation. So this shows that the culture of risk is still very alive in minor league hockey, but Rowan's Law does little to address this. There's no kind of tools being given. There's nothing in the concussion resource to help social actors in sport to disrupt this very ingrained and habitually oriented culture of risk in sport. So if, Rowan's Law isn't doing what the government of Ontario wants it to do, what is actually happening? Well, according to coaches, it's making decision-making very difficult for them. So by downloading responsibility to coaches, Rowan's Law creates a very difficult decision-making paradox for coaches. So what I mean here is that essentially when an athlete is either showing or admitting to a sign or symptom of a concussion, coaches are left with two decisions. They either can remove the athlete from play as the law instructs them to do, but then they could find out in 2 weeks' time that that athlete just had whiplash, or they were fatigued, or they were dehydrated, for example. But then on the other hand, if they do return that athlete to play and they end up getting further injured, then it is their responsibility and they are the ones who return that athlete to play. So because of headache becoming this buzzword, coaches have basically said that he didn't choose his words right. He said the word headache or whatever, and now I had to remove him from play. Oops. And then the other thing is that, it's reproducing the culture of risk, potentially, Rowan's Law. So, and it's doing this because coaches may unintentionally be encouraging athletes to participate in it. So, for example, because of this shift of responsibility to coaches, they're now prefacing injury and prefacing their seasons with words like this. So, this coach very much honestly admitted to me that he now instructs his athletes to choose your words wisely and choose your words right. And by doing this, coaches are not only showing athletes how to participate in the culture of risk, but saying that they should. I could produce a few more examples here, but for time, I'm going to move on. But the thing here is that even though there may be a recent shift in kind of eliminating that culture of risk ideology from sport, that it's possible that these legislations like Rowan's Law are actually reproducing this culture. And so, some overall general conclusions here are that, these medical social controls are devoid of cultural considerations and may actually be reproducing the culture of risk in sport, and that Rowan's Law and similar other concussion legislations are not working as intended. And in other words, that means that athletes are still playing through pain, they're still hiding injury, and they're still sacrificing their bodies for sport. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'm really excited to be talking about this at the end because it's resonating so much with some of the work I've done and just your observations about the reproduction of the culture of risk. I really, really appreciate it. I will, briefly introduce myself as I try to pull up my slides. My name is Kathleen Shinsky, and I am an assistant professor of public health at Muhlenberg College. And I have done most of my sports research from a public health perspective. And in this case, I'm working on hockey, although much of my work has been on football. So it's been really fun to look at both sports. Can I get a quick thumbs up or a shout if you can all see my screen okay?
You're good.
Brilliant, thank you so much. So I'm going to be focusing my talk today on the adoption of helmets and masks in North American, meaning US and Canada, hockey from 1959 to 1979. And the reason I chose these 2 years as my bookends is that 1959 is when Jacques Plante, a goaltender, as you can see, wore a mask. It didn't quite look like this one, but first wore a mask in an NHL game. And 1979 is when the NHL mandated helmets for skaters with a grandfather clause for older skaters going forward. And what I find quite interesting about this time period is that masks were first adopted much more so at the amateur level. And I'm considering in particular the CAHA, which was the name at the time, the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association in Canada, and the US Amateur Hockey Association in the United States. We saw the adoption of mandates for helmets in the 1960s, and then subsequently that was followed in the 1970s at the NHL level. And this overview, drawing on historical research, looking at medical journals and newspaper articles and meeting minutes from the leagues, focuses on the types of cultural change involved in prompting new equipment policies from governing bodies, as well as how such mandates influenced safety norms in the sport. So what was happening before the 1950s? Well, not too much as far as protective equipment was concerned. I'll be really interested to hear from Donald Murray more from his research in the 30s, but I can certainly say from what I was able to dig up, there really wasn't a whole lot of helmet use going on. Helmets were really generally only worn temporarily after an injury had already been sustained to allow players to continue playing, but they weren't really used in a preventive fashion to try to prevent an injury in the first place. It was really only after the injury. And in fact, helmets were so rare that their use was notable enough that it would actually be remarked upon as an unusual feature of the game. And this is just one illustrative example. I found lots of news stories like this. This example is from 1937. It's a New York Times description of a Rangers versus Maple Leafs game. And the way they put it is that there were two players who had previously suffered head wounds in a prior game in Toronto, who started the game in New York wearing helmets. But the headgear proved uncomfortable and they stopped wearing them before the first period was out. And this is pretty typical. Players, well, in this case, didn't even make it through the entire game, or maybe just wore the helmet for one game after they were injured, but it really didn't last very long. Helmets were associated with the idea that you were cowardly or weak or soft. And so the idea was you really don't want to be wearing this very long unless you absolutely have to. But things did start to change in the mid-20th century. And a couple of the key trends that I identified include that the game was getting riskier. This is for a number of reasons, but some include that the slap shot was introduced, there were curved hockey sticks, there were all kinds of developments in the sport of hockey that meant things were moving a lot faster. The puck was moving at higher speeds, and the risks to players' faces and heads were meaningfully increasing. As risky as the game had already been before, the risks were getting magnified yet further. And then I do think Jacques Plante's choice to wear a goalie mask in 1959 was a little bit of a turning point moment. What happened there was that he was struck in the face by a puck. It broke his nose, and he refused to go back out and continue playing as a goaltender unless he was wearing a mask. Now, at the time, it was sort of a homemade mask. This was not a mass-produced or standardized hockey mask, but it was one of the first times that people really started to see a star player consistently begin wearing facial protection in the sport. And I think that did start to shift attitudes a little bit. And the other trend I think is quite important is that there was a lot more organization of youth hockey. So obviously kids have been playing, to some degree organized hockey, but a lot more of it had been street hockey or pond hockey. What you really start to see after World War II is with increased leisure time, increased affluence, with the baby boom, there's just a lot more kids whose parents are signing them up for organized youth leagues. And that started to really push people towards thinking more about introducing protective equipment for heads and faces. And I think that was part of a broader trend towards uniforms and equipment for kids more generally. Uniform and equipments were portrayed as progress in the sport for kids. This is just an example, and I apologize, the image is probably a little grainy and hard to see. This is an example of a before and after picture that was published in Hockey Magazine in 1962. This was a US-based magazine, and you can see the before picture is captioned as this ill-equipped group was representative of the hockey situation in Rhode Island in 1953 when the hockey revival began. And you can see they're described as ill-equipped. They don't all have the same uniform. You don't really see pads there. They're kind of portrayed as a hodgepodge group. And then in the after photo, the caption reads, "The sharp-looking unit represents the progress that has been made during the past 9 years." And you can see they've all got the same uniform on with their team name. They've all got pads. They've all got the same kind of stick. It's representing progress. Now, a challenge for me is that a lot of times players would actually take their helmets off for stage photos, but I did manage to find another photo to just give you an idea of the kind of headgear players were wearing. This was actually the front cover of the magazine the next year. So you can actually see the players were, for this particular photo, keeping their headgear on. Again, obviously very different from modern hockey helmets. There was no facial protection here, but there were these leather head guards that were starting to become increasingly popular. This was a US-based youth team in Minnesota, but many other teams were starting to adopt similar headgear. Now, this was not mandated across the board. The amateur organizations had not yet required all kids to be wearing these kinds of protective headgear pieces. So this was a little bit of a transitional period where you start to see more and more coaches and parents say, "I think I want something on my kid's head when they're playing hockey." You're starting to see some teams adopt the equipment, but it's still a little bit of a hodgepodge. There's still a mix of some teams that are wearing, some not, but you're starting to see more and more youth players begin to adopt protective headgear in some form. And at the same time, you're starting to see the administrators of these youth leagues saying, maybe we should mandate this equipment. And in particular, by November 1960, note that this is just 1 year after Jacques Plante wore his goalie mask, the secretary manager of the CHA wondered, well, maybe players should be made to wear some kind of lightweight helmet. The way he put it is, it's ridiculous to let immature boys go out without protection. And this was the narrative that really developed at this time, was that you didn't need protection if you were a professional player, but if you were a kid, you at that point were not, fully developed. You were more vulnerable. You really needed the protection of some kind of headgear. And this quote from a sports journalist, I think, encapsulates nicely the general attitude that was developing, which was that once you're below the level of the NHL, you've got declines in physical skill, declines in physical superiority, more and more players who need to be protected against those who are out of their class, and of course, from each other. So it was seen as more justified to potentially mandate helmets for kids, and especially given the disparities during the teenage year in sizes of different players, disparities of skill, it was seen as more necessary. But tragically, the mandate didn't actually come until after a player died in Canada. The mandate in both US and Canada came in the mid-1960s, but specifically the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association was really prompted by a tragic case of an Ontario hockey player who died from a head injury. And what happened was the chief coroner of the Attorney General's department said, we have to present this fatality to the association officials. They basically need to be confronted with the reality that a player has died. There was, as you can imagine, significant pressure that resulted from this. This prompted an extended debate on helmet rules. And in May 1965, that was the moment when the CAHA voted to make protective helmets compulsory for all juvenile and under players, specifically all players aged 18 years and younger. So this was the point at which the trend that was already there towards increasing use of headgear at the youth level became a mandate. So what you started to see, which I find absolutely fascinating, is that in the mid-1960s, with the amateur leagues mandating the use of headgear, you start to see a lot more ads targeting youth for protective equipment. And one example that I find really interesting is this pint-sized version of a Pro. What I find especially interesting about this ad is that there really weren't that many actual helmeted adult role models that kids would have seen. The NHL was not yet requiring helmets for its skaters. And so we've got the protective, the manufacturers of protective gear, the sporting goods manufacturers, creating images of adults wearing helmets that youth players probably would not have seen otherwise, to try to further encourage players, or in many cases their parents, to purchase the equipment. And you also see ads that are trying to counter the longstanding narrative that protective headgear was cowardly, or to use the very homophobic term that was often used at the time, a sign of being a sissy or a sign of being soft. And in fact, Cooper Weeks in the mid-1960s directly used this terminology in one of their ads. They said, has hockey turned into a sissy's game? And they said, no, we argue that today's hockey player hasn't gone soft. He's just a little smarter than he was years ago. So what I find really interesting is the ways that we've got helmet manufacturers now trying to counter the idea that wearing a helmet rendered you effeminate or soft, and trying to specifically target their advertisements towards kids, using images of professionals wearing headgear that the kids probably wouldn't have seen elsewhere. The other thing I would note about the fact that the mandates took first place at the amateur level of hockey rather than the professional level is that even though the helmets still remained unpopular among professional hockey players through the 1960s, the players who began wearing them as youths began to perceive them as essential pieces of equipment. And I think this is an important part of understanding this cultural change that was taking place. As one player for the Edmonton Oil Kings put it in 1966, if I played now without my helmet, it would be like stepping out without a stick. So I think it really started to set the stage for subsequent mandates at the professional level by first requiring the headgear at the youth level. And indeed, as I had mentioned previously, in 1979, we see that the NHL made protective helmets mandatory for skaters. They did have a grandfather clause exempting older players, but this was the point at which the mandate started to take place for professionals. And what I find especially interesting, looking at how this change transpired at the NFL, or excuse me, the NHL level, is that changing safety policies by mandating this equipment, by mandating masks and mandating helmets, they sometimes challenge those longstanding attitudes about masculinity and risk, and sometimes drew on those attitudes in ways that shifted the cultural meanings of equipment. And to take goalie masks as example, which we still definitely see today, you started to see the players begin drawing really tough masculine images on their goalie masks. You had snarling animals and skulls and bones and all kinds of tough looking images. And that contributed to shifting the association between masks, as it had been previously with ideas of cowardice, to then present masks as images of toughness, of a player's masculinity and toughness in ways that were more broadly consistent with cultural norms within the sport. So the meaning of the equipment began to shift, particularly as it was mandated and as you had more and more professionals wearing it. So I would just conclude by saying that my read of this history is that the increasing organization of the sport, specifically at the youth level, when you have more and more kids playing organized hockey, elevated the stakes, the medical stakes, the financial stakes, and the cultural stakes in the way that hockey was played, increasing the resistance certainly on the part of some people to deviation from tradition, resistance to the idea of adding equipment that hadn't been there before. But on the other hand, I really think that this increasing organization provided the structure that was needed to promote the widespread adoption of equipment and ultimately to mandate it. And needless to say today, if I say hockey goalie, you imagine somebody wearing a face mask. It is no longer a matter of debate. It is no longer a matter of controversy. Over the last few decades, the helmets and face masks became part of what it meant to be a hockey player. Thank you very much. And I'd love to open it up for any questions anybody might have for any of the speakers. I'm very selfishly going to take the prerogative of moderator to kick things off with a question for Donald that I was wondering from a very selfish point of view. I was curious if Dr. Gray or any of the other physicians you studied in the 1930s, if at any point they ever recommended the use of protective gear, be it a helmet or any other kind of gear to protect against the concussions that they were treating.
In his public writing about hockey, he was more emphasizing discouraging players from being violent towards each other. And just apropos of your comments about helmets, in that same year, a couple of the Boston Bruins for a couple of games also wore helmets, but then they discarded them.
Right. I'm kind of reassured to learn that you found something very similar to what I did, was that maybe they were temporarily wearing them, but it didn't last too long.
Yeah.
Excellent, thanks. So I will keep an eye out on the chat. I also invite people to raise their hands if you have a question, but don't worry, I can keep going if nobody else has a question.
Well, I had a question for you.
Yeah.
And that's how does the hockey helmet progression compare with what you found in football?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think the idea of helmets started much earlier in football, interestingly enough. You may have heard the term leatherheads. They, again, used to just have, pieces of leather, but that was back in the 1920s. And in the 1930s, those sort of leather head guards were required for college football players. So it was sort of much more normalized, I think, in football earlier on to have some kind of head protection. But a big change happened in the 50s and 60s with the switch to plastic helmets. They didn't have the harder material prior, but in the 50s and 60s, with the introduction of plastic helmets in American football, you saw a lot more football players engage in spearing, which basically means effectively leading with your head or using your head as a weapon. And it changed the technique of the game in ways that I think, unfortunately, in some ways actually increased the risks of the sport rather than simply offering added protection. So I think the history of football is interesting because I think there was less resistance to having helmets because it was sort of had a longer history, but at the same time, the risks associated with the helmets, given the tackling involved in football and the sort of techniques that came along with having plastic helmets, made the helmet a little bit more, I would say, a double-edged sword in football, where it increased the risks a little bit more. Whereas my sense as a public health researcher in hockey is there's not a lot of downside to wearing a helmet in hockey. You really need to be wearing it. I see Amy. Oh, please go ahead, Donald. I see Amy says the current state of face mask use by skaters in the NHL seems to mirror your findings for helmets in the 50s. I completely agree. It's really interesting to see some of the same resistance and the same arguments now being seen for visors. And particularly we've seen visors, obviously, and actually full face masks required for younger players, but resistance with the NHL lagging. So I completely agree with that. I see Sean's hand and then Keelan. So Sean, if you want to go ahead first, please.
I find it all really interesting. Of course, I played way back and we had to wear helmets, but we didn't have to wear a face mask. And I can remember as a mite playing, and if they did that nowadays, of course, you'd be arrested or the parents would be arrested for not wearing a face mask. But, I think if you talk to some of the older players who didn't wear helmets in the 70s and 80s, they would say that they thought the game was actually safer because they always said, well, we didn't do some of the things that they do today on the ice because we knew we didn't have helmets, and we wouldn't do the stick work and stuff like that. But I disagree with that, and I think especially Donald talking about some of these major injuries in the 30s, and maybe the concussions weren't publicized, or it wasn't we didn't have as much knowledge of all these things that were happening. What do you think? And I guess I'm directing this at maybe all three of you, but what do you guys think about that notion that the game was maybe to some extent safer, that the arguments, oh yeah, we didn't do the things that they did today because everybody's wearing helmets now?
Donald, do you want to maybe take that one on first from maybe the perspective of the 30s or the earlier time period?
Sure. And my impression is that it was a pretty brutal game. And there was a lot of stick work that happened that you wouldn't get away with today, that people would be appalled. And it wouldn't have the same effect because people's heads weren't as exposed. But the number of people who were cut with sticks or skates or beaten with sticks, and in that same playoff year, there was one player who butt-ended another in the chest where there was no protection and actually stopped his heart, and he had to be revived. So there was some pretty awful stuff done.
And Naya, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I don't know if necessarily towards helmets specifically, but a lot of the coaches in my study commented on how, recently with kind of the heightened attention and the change in regulations and stuff, that now these what would like borderline illegal checks can go unenforced now, and that the enforcers that do still exist in minor league hockey, which coaches say that they do, kind of are able to run amok a little bit more now because there's no kind of that ability to revenge those hits now. So I think in that regard, some injuries and some behaviors kind of get are taken up differently now, I guess is what I'm trying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to what my fellow presenters observed, but I guess I would just also generally say the term we use in public health for this is called risk compensation. And the idea is it's sort of a theory that in some contexts, maybe if you add a piece of protection, people quote unquote compensate for the extra safety by taking on additional levels of risk. And that sometimes happens in some circumstances and sometimes doesn't. And it's really complicated to evaluate. And as Naya pointed out, you have to kind of keep in mind the cultural context in which it's happening. But I've seen that argument made in sort of like ludicrous contexts, like motorcycle helmets will make you drive your motorcycle slightly faster, and therefore it's adding a ton more risk. And that I can say is like blatantly not supported by the data. Motorcycle helmets are awesome. On the other hand, I think there is more of an argument for risk compensation in something like tackle football or in boxing, where the addition of the glove, you protect your hand, but you can hit harder in ways that is more harmful to players' heads. And so I think it's really interesting, as you point out, to think about these arguments in hockey and the extent to which they aren't supported by data, the extent to which there might be some changes that are made with the introduction of equipment, and also how that interacts, as Naya pointed out, with enforcement of rules and other kinds of contexts. Thank you so much for a fascinating question.
Well, thank you.
Brilliant. And I'd love to turn it over to Keelan, who's got their hand up.
Yeah, thank you and merci to all the presenters. Each of your presentations was so well done and so fascinating. My question's for Naya. My background is in linguistics and translation, and I absolutely agree with your analysis that the wording of Rowan's law in Ontario is unfortunate for such an important piece of legislation. My question to you is, do you know of any other laws in a different province or state that appeared to be better worded and more effective? Did Ontario just kind of miss the mark, and could they tweak this law? Or is it really the only legislation of its kind out there, is what I'd like to know.
Yeah, so in the United States, there's a legislation called listed law, which is adopted by, I'm fairly certain, all of the states now. It's essentially almost word for word what Rowan's law is. If anything, Rowan's law, I would say adopted listed law, because listed law was implemented much earlier. And it's very similar. Some scholars that have done discourse analysis on the law have come to similar findings. And then as far as I know, that's the only, there's been policy changes in Scotland and Europe, but not specifically like a law in the sense that Rowan's law and listed law, just more so the policy changes as a response to the death of a young athlete there. If that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
This is a quick follow-up to that. In the United States, do any of the laws do any better of a job of specifying like the designated person piece in terms of, if it has to be an athletic trainer or a coach, or if, a volunteer parent can be that person? Or I guess I'm just curious if you've sort of seen similar language around that designated person in some of those other laws as well.
Yeah, so the thing is that like the provinces vary a lot. So I know that there's an article, it's from Cook and all, I think, and they kind of outline what each of the different states kind of do. So the designated person does, I believe, appear in some of them, but it's very, very vague, very ambiguous, not much direction going on whatsoever.
Thanks so much. Something that stood out to me from your presentation, just because I thought, oh my gosh, I've come across this language so much and I'm so bummed that it's still persisting, was that badge of honor language. And I guess this might be a question to both of you. I was actually going to ask Donald first, if you'd come across that again, in Dr. Gray's work or other people in the 1930s describing at that time period injuries in hockey as a badge of honor, or sort of a positive thing in some ways.
My sense, it was just kind of expected that you would get back into the line of duty as quickly as possible, because rosters were much smaller then. The games were just as long. And so if you weren't able to come back, you were hurting your team by not coming back. So I think that part of what created the culture of where we are today.
And then I guess that sets me up to throw it back over to Naya in terms of where we are today. I guess this is a very meta question, but your sense from your research on the reasons this idea is persisting, the kinds of changes that might need to happen to actually more fundamentally challenge this idea, or any broader thoughts you have on it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I was actually having a really interesting discussion panel a couple days ago, or I guess on Friday, about like how the concept of like, you know, are you hurt or are you injured? And, you know, again, the badge of honor thing, you know, people think that it's kind of been alleviated in a certain regard. And the reality is that, you know, according to these coaches, it's not. And I think at the parental level and at the coaching level, we're maybe seeing a bit of a shift. But the you know, at the athlete level, it's I think we were just hearing from maybe the panel this morning where it's that idea of like, you know, the 13-year-olds are watching the 15-year-olds who are watching the 21-year-olds who, you know, and so it's like it's so culturally ingrained and you know, habitually effective that it's I don't even think it's like a conscious thing that's going on right now. I think it's just so ingrained within the sporting environment that we need to find a way to actually like disrupt its nature. And I mean, I don't know how to do that yet, but you know, we need to figure.
I would add that when you read the newspapers from back in those days, they would use photographs of the players in the hospital and talk about players getting out of their hospital bed, coming and playing the game, and then going right back to their hospital bed. So that would reinforce all those things.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. I see Deanna's hand is up, please.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for your presentations. And Naya, you just kind of sparked my interest in say, you know, we keep looking at legislation, we keep looking at language that's been used historically to talk about injury. So my question is, what do you, for all three of you, what do you propose in changing the way we, you know, treat concussions? How do we get to the cultural component of it? What are the ways in which you can envision these ways we can actually make changes that address culture is my question for everybody.
I could jump in first. I would propose, you know, education that is not oriented, just medically oriented, that, you know, we focus on education that, you know, displays that this culture of risk exists and talk about breaking it down, and, you know, that this information needs to be disseminated, you know, more interactionally, whether it's through a module, whether it's through presentations. You know, we need to move away from the PDF document that can be signed on the dotted line and start actually teaching and admitting that this culture exists.
I don't really have anything to add from a medical point of view, but I can say that each of the people I spoke about in my piece lived well into the 1970s. Some were very successful businessmen. And although some other players were described as having a tough time in their later years, these three weren't. These three performed at a very high level for years in the Montreal area.
Something I found really interesting from the case study of the adoption of helmets was that in that sort of funny transitional period where some players were starting to adopt them on their own, but it wasn't mandated yet. One journalist put it this way, that there were sort of three categories of players: players who were okay wearing a helmet, would actively choose to; players who were like adamantly, you know, I'm not going to do this unless you make me; and then the sort of majority, as they put it, of players who probably wanted protection, but weren't going to be the first one to wear it if they didn't have to. And the argument was, we've hit a point where you have to have a mandate. The idea was, we're not going to get more players to wear the helmet unless you actually require it across the board. And my sense is that's often how cultural change starts to happen. You have the couple people in the vanguard who, you know, are the Jacques Plante types who, like, I don't care if people call me a coward, I'm going to put this mask on and protect my nose. But you have a much larger number of people who aren't going to make that change or take that next step unless it's mandated. And on that note, something I thought was really interesting, I'll put a link to this in the chat if anyone wants to see a picture. On that injury is badges of honor note, and trying to shift the culture around that. One of the most interesting mask decoration examples I found was Gary Cheevers, who drew scars on his goalie mask to represent where he would have gotten injured or would have had stitches if not for the mask. And having this sort of visual representation of the injury prevented, I think both maintained that sense of toughness and gave him a way to have the badge of honor without having the stitches, so to speak. So cultural change that allows you to sort of maintain whatever that was, in this case, that badge of honor that had been associated with getting injured in a safer way. It's much safer to have your badge of honor be on your mask as compared to your actual face, is the kind of thing that might need to happen for players to feel sort of socially safe making that change, if there's some way they can preserve that image of toughness going forward. So this is a thought from a public health person who's not an expert on sociology or anthropology, but in terms of sponsoring cultural change, I think that might be one aspect that could help promote it. I think we are, oh, thank you for a fantastic question. I think we're at the end of our time. I'm happy to stick around if anyone wants to keep the conversation going, but I also want to note there's going to be a fantastic keynote speaker coming up in just, I guess, 3 minutes. So I want to make sure anyone who wants to go to that has the time to go to that. So I want to thank you all. Thank you to our fabulous other speakers for your talks. And thank you all for being here to have this conversation, and wishing you a wonderful rest of your Sundays. Take care, everybody.